What's up, fellas? In today's video, we're going to be talking about Danny Ainge of the Boston Celtics, a GM that for the longest time, I think the opinion has been that this guy's really good at his job. It's an opinion that I shared for a really long time. And recently I was just kind of thinking, is that actually true? Is that actually the case? Have we been overrating Danny Ainge as a GM? I'm not saying that's the case, but we're going to have that conversation in today's video. But quickly, before we get started, if you enjoy content like this, then consider subscribing to the channel. I upload twice a day, every single day on this channel. So if you're looking for the most consistent NBA content on YouTube, this is a great place to be. You can also like the video as well, and you can check me out at various socials at the bottom of the screen and a link tree down in the description below. With those things said, let's talk about Danny Ainge. So this is a conversation that only recently came about for me because going back to some of the earliest stuff that I was talking about, not only on this channel, but even before that I was having conversations with my friends, throughout my NBA basketball, analysis journey, I've been on the side of the Celtics and I've been on the side of Danny Ainge. And I thought that, they've always done a really good job of developing their players, of getting good players, of positioning themselves well within the salary cap. And when I really sat down and have thought about it over the last couple of days, I've realized that maybe I was overvaluing a lot of those things, because there's a few moves that you can't really argue with. Like they're overwhelmingly positive in Danny Ainge and the Boston Celtics as a whole favor. And there's nothing that you can say negative about these things. The first is getting Isaiah Thomas from the Phoenix Suns initially for not a whole lot, and him becoming an all-NBA caliber player for them that instigated a lot of the things that then came after for Boston, most notably, of course, being a significant piece in the Kyrie Irving trade. And despite Kyrie leaving, that was still a significant get for Boston. And then the other one, of course, is the Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, Brooklyn Nets trade. That is arguably the most one-sided, and in the Boston Celtics case, greatest trade in NBA history, trading aging veterans for now two foundational pieces in Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, and of course the drafting of those players. However, when you look outside of that, as it relates to team building, as it relates to drafting, as it relates to free agency signings, there are a lot of question marks here that kind of make you think, is the reputation of Ainge and of the Celtics, kind of team building over the last 10 years or so, really only held up by a few moves, and as a whole, they haven't actually done a great job? Well, let's have that conversation. So if you take away those two moves, what does Boston have? Yes, they drafted Marcus Smart, who's been a good player. And of course, not just acquiring the picks to get Brown and Tatum, but drafting them and developing them. But if you take those guys away, the Gordon Hayward signing was fine at the time, and one that everybody, in the league would have done. If most teams in the league, if Gordon Hayward had gone to them and said, hey, I want to go there, they would have signed him to the max, just like Boston did. And it's unfortunate the way that injury worked out. The Horford signing was fine, and he was a good player for them for a few years, and then they let him walk. The Kyrie thing is still very, very odd. The fact that they gave up significant assets, and I guess, I don't know, I'm sure they got some semblance of a commitment from Kyrie, but then the fact that he leaves, of course, is not great, because you gave up, those picks and those assets for not a whole lot. And then the big one more recently, of course, is the Kemba Walker free agency signing. And in the wake of Kyrie leaving, they felt like they needed to replace him, and they did their best, and they brought in Kemba in what was a really surprising move, because people didn't anticipate Boston being a free agency destination, because not only did Kyrie leave, but Al Horford opted out of his deal, and suddenly they were dealing with all the salary cap space. But when you look at, the whole picture over the last 10 years or so, I think you can make an argument that they haven't actually done a very good job. When you look at drafting players outside of Brown, Tatum, and Marcus Smart, there's not a whole lot to speak of on this roster, and there was plenty of volume. There were plenty of opportunities for them to get players to be important within this rotation. And there were even years in which they had too many first-round picks, and there were guys that they would pick and then would immediately not really be part of the future because they had so many first-round picks in a given year. 2 and 3 years in a row of having, 2 and 3 first-round picks. There's going to be situations like someone like RJ Hunter, where he gets drafted and barely gets an opportunity. Or you go back to like Yabusele or whatever. Like they always have guys, but none of them really develop in a significant way, of course, outside of Brown, Tatum, and Smart. And that calls into question the drafting, right? And I've made videos in the past saying that as a result of bringing in Brown and Tatum and Smart, the Celtics are one of the best drafting teams of the last 5 years in the NBA. But outside of those, when you consider the volume, you could make an argument that they're one of the bottom half of the league teams in terms of drafting. And then again, it's the opportunities that they've had over the years to improve the roster that they've not taken advantage of. And ultimately, it appears as though, obviously, the decision to keep Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, throughout the years as they were in a number of different trade rumors, ultimately was the correct call. Both of these guys are really, really good players, but you couldn't have used any of those first-round picks to improve. You couldn't have, created a situation that makes this a bit more of a bright future outside of just Tatum and Brown and Smart. It's kind of mind-boggling that was never a situation that happened for Boston, considering all the opportunities that they did have over the years, which again calls into question whether or not Ainge is actually good at his job or not. Now, one thing I will give them credit for is when I was, a couple years ago, when I was really on the side of Ainge and of the Celtics, it was because they had a very clear plan. At the time in which they had Kyrie, Al Horford, Gordon Hayward, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, when they had all those guys on the roster, it was clear what the plan was, right? So they had these bigger contracts, of course, the max guys, Hayward, Horford, and Kyrie Irving. Those were the max players, right? And then you could see on the salary cap sheet that they were then planning on, potentially either letting Al Horford and Gordon Hayward walk or, signing them to smaller deals, because then at that point, Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum would need new deals. And it was clearly lined up well in a way that they were taking advantage of the rookie contracts while also leaving them flexibility to re-sign Tatum and Brown to big contracts, which ultimately ended up being the case. And so in terms of how they kind of maneuvered the salary cap for years, that was always a really positive aspect of this thing. But now that they've really invested in someone like Kemba Walker, and now that they're going to be paying Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, deservedly so, big numbers, you can't help but feel like there's a missed opportunity here, to cash in on some of those first round picks in the past and to, really get another high quality player while Kyrie and Horford and Hayward were all still there. And then even now with Kemba still here, and now we're at the point where the thing that's going to be carrying this team moving forward for years and years and years is, of course, Brown and Tatum, as it should be. But again, if you take away that move, which again is such an incredibly positive move for Boston, but if you take that away, where does that leave them? So I think ultimately the argument centers around, do you feel like it was a little bit lucky that Boston even ended up with as good of the picks as they did in the Brooklyn trade? Because at the time, yes, Garnett and Pierce were getting older, but people always believed that the Nets were going to be at least decent. There was not really a scenario that existed in most people's minds in which these picks became really valuable. Otherwise, the Nets never would have given them up. And pretty much immediately, it fell apart. Darren Williams, started to get injured. Ownership no longer wanted to spend money. They started cutting costs. And all of a sudden, they were a really, really bad team. And that has, as much to do with what Brooklyn was doing as it did for what Boston was doing. And at the time, you could make the argument that had things gone better in Brooklyn, then obviously Brown and Tatum don't end up in Boston. And things look much different now for the Celtics. So the argument really centers around, is there a good amount of luck involved in that deal that kind of creates everything about the future of this team? Or are you saying, that was a really smart move by Boston to move on from those veteran guys? A lot of teams at the time were not doing things like that, and they would have just held on to those guys and let them retire as Boston Celtics. So it was a nice, progressive, aggressive move by Danny Ainge and to set up the entire future. And yes, there's been some missteps, but you have to give them so much credit for that specific move and for the drafting and development of Brown and Tatum that it overshadows all the other mistakes? Or are you of the mindset that the overall evidence points towards a rather negative outlook of Danny Ainge as the GM of the Boston Celtics, and the only thing that is saving it from being a complete disaster is that initial Nets move that gets them Brown and Tatum and then the development of those players? Because I think you could honestly be on either side of that argument. I think you could realistically say Danny Ainge is a good general manager because so often it comes down to getting the guys in the NBA. You have to get the players, the top tier guys on your roster to be a competitive team and to be a really good team. And they have two of them. And not many teams in the league can say they have two of them. And very few, or even fewer can say that they have them, signed long-term, under contract, and are really good at such a young age. And so you can make an argument that's the overall job. That's the primary job of an NBA general manager, is not to be a 45-win team every year and to kind of piece it together, but to create a situation in which there is a significant amount of upside and you go and get the players. And Danny Ainge has done that with that one move. But you could also make the argument that outside of one move, he's not done enough to continue to build up the proper pieces on this roster with misstep after misstep, whether that be in the draft or free agency, and has now put himself in a situation to put the team in a situation in which they are now overly reliant on that one move, and were unable to now capitalize on the advantage that provided them, thus making Danny Ainge not a great general manager. I am more on the second half of that than I am on the first now. Who knows what will happen down the road, but I think it's worth asking, if this is kind of like a one-hit wonder or two-hit wonder type situation with Danny Ainge as the general manager of the Boston Celtics in the modern era, the last 5 to 7 years of the Boston Celtics. But I'm interested to see what you guys have to say down in the comment section below. But with all those things said, I thank you guys very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day, and I will see you all next time.